All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. So next up, we have Dr. Jose Antonio. He earned his doctorate and completed a postdoctoral research fellowship at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. He is the CEO and co-founder of the International Society of Sports Nutrition. He's also the program director of the Exercise and Sports Science program at Nova Southeastern University, which is in Florida. Dr. Antonio has published more than 100 he has more than 100 research publications, and he's written multiple textbooks in the area of sports nutrition. Recently, Dr. Antonio has been studying high protein diets in active individuals in his lab, and I would definitely say that he is a pioneer in the high protein research realm. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you to Dr. Antonio, and whenever you're ready, Joey, take it away.
Thank you, Tricia. Hopefully sometimes my audio tends to act up, but let's see what we got. Okay, today, the way I'm framing this presentation is a series of questions. And I think for those of you who are scientists or have an interest in becoming a scientist, it's not often the answers you get, but the questions you generate. Because for those of you in graduate school in particular, you'll realize that the more you learn, the more you realize you don't really know that much. And even as, having done this now for almost 3 decades, you really do realize that there's so much more to learn, even though you think you're answering all these important questions. So let's move forward here. Fortunately, my computer's a little slow today. Okay. So going back to when I was an undergrad, I heard this quite a bit. Eating a lot of protein is bad for your kidneys. And it is so far back that the Police had the #1 song at the time, and Ronald Reagan was president. So for those you can think that far back, that's a long time ago. Now, one of the more popular ad campaigns, and this is when cigarette ad campaigns were actually allowed, was the Virginia Slims ad. Virginia Slims was a cigarette brand that was targeted to women. And they actually had probably the most famous tagline out of all cigarette brands: "You've come a long way, baby." However, moving forward 3 decades, have we really come a long way? I saw this headline from a website, The Blogging Doctors. So these are medical doctors. And it was really some goofy article saying that too much protein is just as bad as smoking. I mean, it sounds pretty stupid, but there's a lot of people who believe this. And this is actually a PowerPoint slide from one of my former students who took a class, not my class, obviously, where the professor listed all the things that could absolutely go wrong when you eat too much protein. Greater risk of heart disease, kidney stones, loss of calcium from bones, risk of colon cancer, and also displacement of other nutrient-rich foods. Now, clearly all of this is wrong. However, we also know that there's a lot of people who believe this stuff. And before I go further, I do want to mention that a lot of the experiments that we've done in the past really required a lot of collaboration from students, from other faculty, from friends, et cetera, et cetera. I listed a lot of the main contributors, but really we work with a lot of people. Science is not a solo endeavor. You really, it really requires a lot of help from a lot of different people. So I just want to say a quick thank you to all those that have helped me. So the question is, if all this protein is so bad, why do guys who work out eat so much of it? And before we answer that question, I think a lot of us need to look at, even though it may not seem intuitive, but we need to look at exercise science from an evolution standpoint. And one of my favorite classes as an undergrad was an evolutionary biology class. Oddly enough, I was a biology major because back then, this is how long it's been back then, there really wasn't exercise science. So as a bio major, I learned quite a bit of evolution. And as animals, because we are animals, we have 2 priorities. That's we need to be alive and we want to reproduce. So survival and reproduction. Survival and reproduction, that's what evolutionary biologists always hone in on. That's all our behaviors seem to focus around that. Obviously, you need to be alive before you do anything else. So we want to be alive. So does it make evolutionary sense And the question is, in the context of evolution, think of modern humans were nomadic until about 10,000 years ago, right? It was about 10,000 years ago that the agricultural revolution started. So humans started to learn how to grow food. But before that, you know, where did humans find food? Well, it was either stuff that was growing on the ground or it was animals they killed. And you ain't going to survive eating nuts and berries that are growing from the ground. Possibly if you lived in a tropical climate, you could survive based on the calories from fruits. But at the end of the day, you still need protein. So it was feast or famine for prehistoric man. So the question of limiting food intake at times of starvation seems like a really silly survival strategy. Why would eating a lot of protein, i.e. meat and or organs, be harmful to kidney function when the most energy dense food at the time was likely meat or organs? So think about it. You haven't consumed food in 24 to 48 hours, probably longer because you don't have a refrigerator. You catch an animal, kill it, you're eating it. I doubt your caveman buddy next to you isn't going to say, hey, you've hit 30 grams of protein, time to stop. No, you're starving, you want to eat. And your body isn't dumb. It knows what to do with that food. It doesn't waste it. So the question is, what exactly is a high amount of protein? And I think this is where, if you talk to a clinician, they have a definition. If you talk to sports scientists, they have a definition. And the context of this talk is within sports and exercise. It is not with a clinical population. It's not with even sort of a general population. It's with people who like to work out and work out a lot, which, let's face it, is hardly anybody. The vast majority of people do nothing in this country. And so you take the 30% that are not overweight or obese, and even that 30%, it's only the minority that work out fairly hard. Most people don't do anything. So you got to remember that's the context of this talk. So how have scientists defined high protein diets? Well, these are the various definitions I've seen, all of which are wrong, just so you know. 35% of total calories are exceeding 35% of total calories. Well, if you're on a low calorie diet, it doesn't matter if you're exceeding 35%, you ain't getting any protein. And let's face it, a lot of people are on low calorie diets. Anything more than the RDA, well, that is a low bar. So if you're a fan of hitting low bars, hey, that's a low one. And then one which is semi-reasonable, anything more than 1.2 grams per kilo, which is still low. If you're at 1.3 grams per kilo, I would hardly call that high. I would call that low. So what exactly is tall? Well, Tiger Woods, by any normal definition, is tall because he's taller than the average male. But next to someone who's 7'6" tall, clearly he's not tall. So there has to be context to this. So for athletes, what is a high intake of dietary protein? So does it make sense to use 1.2 grams per kilo as a standard? Of course not. So I would define high as anything that exceeds 2.2 grams per kilo, or in the freedom units, anything that exceeds 1 gram per pound per day. So pick your units, stick to it. To me, anything that exceeds that, by definition, at least in my scientific opinion, would be high. So let's first just really briefly look at some overfeeding data. So what happens when you overfeed or eat too much? One study, I mean, there's really not many studies in this category, mainly because it's hard to get people to volunteer for a study, knowing that they might get fatter. Imagine that, hey, you want to be an overfeeding study? Yeah, you're probably going to get fatter, but what the hell, it's for science, right? No one wants to do that. So almost all studies are diet studies, meaning hypocaloric studies. But if you look at the overfeeding data, pretty much all of it, except some of the work we've done, is overfeeding on carbs and fat. Now, when you overfeed on carbs and fat, what happens? Well, you get fat, but part of that energy balance equation, this isn't surprising. We all know it. Heck, we all will experience it from Thanksgiving till January 1. So this is basically, where this data is sort of explaining the obvious. If energy intake exceeds output, you will gain weight, particularly if that energy intake is in the form of carbs and fat. Now, this really leads to a series of questions that we asked going back probably 2013, 2014. The first question is, and this is really based on observations of bodybuilders. And for those of you who've ever been around the physique sports, you'll notice that, well, they eat a lot of protein and they're not really fat. So there's something going on based on how they eat. So the first question we ask is, what happens when you get trained subjects and the only variable you change is total protein consumed? And this was published in 2014. So we did the data collection in 2013. And basically they ate over 5 times the RDA for protein, right? They did it for 2 months. These were college students, and they changed nothing else. It was just eat more protein. And of course, the protein wasn't in the form of food. It was in the form of protein shakes, because there's no way any human being is going to eat this much protein in food. I think your muscles of mastication would be so tired that you wouldn't even have the energy to eat because they would literally be so tired. So again, 2 months, look at the data on actual intake. The control group, about 1.8, 1.9 grams per kilo. The high protein group went up to about 4.4 grams per kilo. Keep in mind that a lot of people would look at the control group as actually a very high protein diet, which is fine. They can call it whatever they want. Either way, one group is a lot more than the other group, right? It's a lot more. Well, in terms of body composition, nothing changed, which is really interesting because the high protein group ate a lot more calories, actually. So at least with this particular very simple study, I would say it's really hard to get fat if all you did was drink a lot of protein shakes. So keep that in mind. You know, oftentimes these studies are framed as high protein diet studies. And I'll tell you this, I hate doing diet studies. So technically it isn't really a diet study. It's eat a lot of protein in the form of a shake study. Because whenever you try to alter diet, which I think is one of the hardest, if not the hardest behavior to change, people are just really bad with it. So to me, I try to keep these fairly simple so that subjects comply. And compliance in this case was you just got to drink a lot of shakes in addition to eating your food. Now, the irony of this study was that was actually hard to do. There was, I think we had 25, almost 30% of people dropping out of this study. I think we started out near 100 subjects and 25 or 30 dropped out. Why? Because they said they just couldn't eat that much. They could not drink that many shakes. They were sick of consuming stuff. So we decided, well, there's a second question we could ask then. Let's drop the protein intake so that we get better adherence or compliance. But then we put all the subjects on what I would call a traditional bodybuilding training program. It was a typical split routine, chest, shoulders, tries, back, bis, legs, alternated, typically sort of a 3-day on, 1-day off schedule or a 2-day on, 1-day off. But they average 5 days a week. And this is published in 2015. Again, normal versus high protein. Look at the protein intake. You'll notice that the control group actually is on a high protein diet. The high protein group is on a really high protein diet. So even within this study, we're comparing a high protein diet with a really high protein diet. So everyone's on a lot of protein. Also notice the amount of calories consumed per day. The high protein group was consuming roughly 500 more calories per day. What happened? Well, in terms of fat mass, the higher protein group or high protein group actually lost more fat, which was kind of interesting. However, in terms of lean body mass, the high protein group and the control, which is really another high protein group, they gained the same amount of lean mass. I mean, it was actually almost identical. So it seems that there might be a limit in terms of protein intake to increase lean body mass. However, in terms of promoting a fat mass loss, that is where maybe eating more protein is beneficial. So we asked a third question because if I go back to this data here, we asked the third question because people were still rather confused about, how can you lose more fat if you're eating more calories, yet lean body mass increases the same. Part of that, part of the questions that came from the study was questions of safety because they're still eating a high protein diet for 2 months. So we followed up with this question. What happens when exercise trained individuals consume a high protein diet for up to a year. And this was really more of a safety study more than anything else, because one of the biggest criticisms of consuming protein, particularly when you work with people in the clinical realm, is that it's harmful. Despite the fact that there's no data to show it's harmful. It's just one of those odd things that it sort of reminds me, and most of you, weren't around in the 1960s and 70s when very few people exercised. And physicians would often say, well, don't exercise too much because it stresses your heart. And if you stress your heart, you'll die sooner, which of course we all know that's stupid, but it's the same thing. It's what we're hearing about kidneys. Well, you're stressing your kidneys because you're consuming more protein. Well, guess what? That's the job of your kidneys. It's to filter stuff. That's what it's meant to do. Your body adapts quite well to all these things. So this was published in 2016. After 1 year, these are pretty well-trained male bodybuilders. After 1 year of a high protein diet, their blood lipids are perfect. In fact, I wish my blood lipids were like this. If you look at total cholesterol, it's a flat line, high density lipoprotein, triglycerides, low density lipoprotein. It all is pretty much flatline. Nothing changes despite the fact that they're consuming a hell of a lot of protein. And then we look at kidney function, again, after 1 year. Nothing really changes with blood urea nitrogen, creatinine, estimated glomerular filtration rate. So I tend to look at GFR as the primary measure. And again, nothing happens. This is after 1 year. And to me, 1 year is a long time. I mean, if nothing changes in a year, then it's probably not going to change. However, the University of Google PhDs, because there are many of them, actually there's a lot of Facebook PhDs too, and Instagram PhDs, and they're all over the place. I mean, I've never met so many. They said that 1 year isn't enough. You got to do it more than a year. I mean, 10 years, maybe 20, maybe 50, maybe until they die, So we're like, okay, man, you guys are annoying me. So we followed up with some of the hardcore bodybuilders for another year. So this is basically case reports after 2 years in well-trained bodybuilders on a high protein diet. Their mean age is 30. You'll notice by year 2, they're consuming on average roughly 3.5 grams per kilo. So these guys are consuming a lot of protein. And again, we're providing it in the form of powder. It's not like they're eating 5 steaks a day and 10 chicken breasts. They're drinking protein. And again, that's one of the caveats, because people, when people think of high protein diets, they're always thinking, well, they're eating a lot of steak, a lot of eggs, drinking a lot of milk, when in fact, I don't think it's even possible to eat this much protein from food. You're just going to be tired of eating. So it's from shakes. That's how they're getting it. And when we look at these clinical measures, look at kidney function, blood urea nitrogen, creatinine, GFR, going from baseline to year 2, nothing happens. If we look at liver enzymes, AST and ALT, from baseline to year 2, nothing happens. So both kidney function, hepatic function, nothing changes. And they're eating a lot of protein. Now, I do want to mention one of my favorite subjects. His name is Stefano Roman. He loved coming to the lab, mainly because he just liked getting free protein. However, I asked him what his story was, and he described himself as a former fat guy. Those are his words. He at one point was over 400 pounds, and he decided he needed to do something about losing weight because, he felt, out of control, depressed, et cetera, he decided, well, these guys who are lean, they seem to lift weights a lot, and they seem to eat a lot of protein. So what did he do? He decided to lift weights and eat a lot of protein. And so he's lean now. He's a very, very dedicated bodybuilder. He consumes probably more protein on average per day than any human being I know. So I wanted to show you his the day where he consumed 1,238 grams of protein. And if you sort of glance at what he was eating that day, you'll notice he's not eating any carbs, which I'm like, wow, no carbs. And it's just all, let's see, ground turkey, cookies and cream protein bar, chicken breast, ground turkey, chicken breast, 6 scoops of whey protein, chicken breast, ground turkey, protein bar, chicken breast, ground turkey, chicken breast, 6 more scoops of whey protein, chicken breast. Not a diet I would recommend. However, it is interesting that he could actually consume this much. Now, keep in mind that his average, on average, he consumes about 400 to 500 grams per day. To him, a low day, for some reason he can't get enough protein, is like 300 grams per day, which is probably a high day for 99.999% of the world. So he consumes a lot of protein. So based on those prior questions, we asked a 5th question because, you know, I always get a hard time from everyone saying, how come you don't do studies in women? Well, okay, we'll do a study in women. Now, I will say this, having done this now for more than half a decade, these sort of high protein feeding studies, it's much easier to convince guys to overfeed than women. And that's just the way it is. Women typically don't want to overfeed because there's that chance you may be gaining fat and not lean mass. However, we were able to consume some really well-trained women to consume a high protein diet for a year. And we looked at the primary clinical endpoint we looked at was bone mineral density. So again, a 1-year study, protein intake about 2.3 grams per day. We had a smattering of world-class runners, CrossFit competitors, physique athletes, even a world-class paddler, a couple of them in this study. This was published in the Journal of Functional Morphology and Kinesiology. And what did we find? Well, when we looked at whole body bone mineral density, after 1 year, nothing changed. More specifically, when we looked at lumbar spine bone mineral density, this was measured through a DEXA. Again, nothing changed, it flatlined. So you're going to see some change in bone mineral density. I would suspect you'd see it in a year because that's a long time. Now, keep in mind, you know, again, the context of this data and this talk is framed around people who work out a lot. And people say, well, what would happen if someone ate that much protein who didn't work out? And my answer to that is people don't work out, don't eat that much protein. So it's kind of a silly question. It doesn't happen in the real world. So all of these studies are people who train really hard. This isn't for the recreational, you know, you walk your poodle 3 times a week around the block for 30 minutes. This is not them. That's not what this is for. This is for people who train seriously for whatever their event is, whether it's physique, whether it's run, bike, swim, whether it's CrossFit. It's for them. People who don't train don't eat this much protein. And mainly because it's what fun is it? I mean, it's more fun to eat carbs and fat, right? It tastes better. So we also looked at their kidney function. We did a basic metabolic panel on these women. And again, if you look at glomerular filtration rate, the 4th line down, EGFR, nothing. And really, this data agrees with all the other prior data that was primarily in men, showing no negative effects on renal function. So clearly, eating a lot of protein is not harmful to your bones. So we decided to do another follow-up, but instead we were looking at the interaction of genes and diet and how your genetics might modify body composition. And for those of you who slept through biology or cell biology or biochem, where the professor was talking about genetics and nucleotides, etc., sort of a quick, brief explanation. We know that your genes are a sequence of nucleotides and that you have what are called base pairs. And if you notice in the cartoon, A typically pairs with T, G typically pairs with C. Okay, those are your nucleotides and they form a pairing. Now you have what are called SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms. And the way a SNP occurs is that you're getting one nucleotide to replace another. Hence the name single nucleotide polymorphism. So in this case, the SNP is a G is replacing an A. Now there are multiple SNPs for whatever gene. However, we decided to look at a particular gene called the FTO gene. Or some people, you could just call it by the long name, the fat mass and obesity associated gene. Now, this gene is involved in overweight and obesity. Depending on the SNP, it might be related to brown fat. It might be related to the way your brain perceives satiety. However, there are ethnic differences in terms of the prevalence of the gene, at least the risk variance of the gene. So the sixth question we asked, which I thought might have been the most interesting, is we had people who are pretty hardcore exercisers. We had them cut their calories by 20%. And then we genotyped them to see if they got the risk allele for the FTO gene, meaning the ones who are more likely to put on fat, versus those that are normal, right? So you have normal risk, higher risk. And this was published in 2019 in ISSN. So again, these are well-trained people, 4-week diet. They maintain their protein intake at roughly 2 grams per kilo. So sort of high, not quite high, but it's high enough. Again, they dropped their calories by 20%. So the blue bar represents the non-risk group, meaning they have the normal risk for obesity, their FTO gene is normal. Red bar represents the risk group, right? So these are the ones who theoretically should be at higher risk for putting on fat mass. So what happens? Well, guess what? When you cut calories, you lose weight. Not surprising, but what's the composition of the weight? And this is where it's kind of interesting. The loss of fat mass actually exceeded, was higher in the risk group, the higher risk group, than the normal risk group. Again, not statistically significant, but you can see that you still lose fat mass. Changes in fat-free mass, there was no difference between either group. However, when you look at change in percent body fat, the group that actually was at higher risk for putting on fat actually had a greater change in percent fat, meaning a greater loss in terms of percent fat than the non-risk group. Total body water, no difference. You could say that maybe that greater decrease in percent fat might have been due to, even though it's not statistically significant, maybe they did cut their calories a little bit more, at least the risk group versus the non-risk group, possibly. So what we found is the randomized controlled trial doesn't agree with cross-sectional data. If you look at cross-sectional data, it does suggest that those at higher risk should carry more fat. But what we could conclude from this study is that at least in the short run, having the risk alleles, at least for these 3 SNPs, we actually looked at 3 different SNPs, doesn't confer a disadvantage, meaning as Matt alluded to earlier, and I think as pretty much all of us allude to, calories still rule. I mean, if you eat less, you lose weight. Chris Algieri, one of our good friends who frequents our lab, he's a professional fighter. He let me show this data. He does carry the risk allele on the FTO gene. But as Chris likes to say, hey, you can either eat like a pig or eat well. If you eat well, you won't get fat, right? So he has the T to C nucleotide change in this particular SNP. Should be an increased risk for obesity, yet he's always lean. Why is he always lean? Well, remember, context. He works out like crazy. He eats well 99% of the time. So in conclusion, particularly in this study, genetics is not destiny, okay? And I know people, they all want to look at their genes and see if they're predisposed to X, Y, and Z, but at the end of the day, you control your environment. You control what you put in your mouth. And I want to mention this because this is just total horseshit, is someone sent this to me. The ISSA has, you can become a DNA-based fitness coach, which is total bull. I mean, we don't have enough data so that you can, be a fitness coach based on your DNA. So I just want to put this out there in case you see it, because it's just absurd, absolutely absurd. So I do want to mention a few things. I want to update you on some of the new research from exercise science department at Nova Southeastern University. This is in addition to some of the traditional sports nutrition research we're doing, we're also venturing into the sports neuroscience realm. This is actually data that we just collected basically this week. looking at energy drink with caffeine, and we found that something called pattern comparison processing speed was enhanced with caffeine. This is, if you're not familiar with some of these cognitive tests, just do a Google search or PubMed search of the NIH toolbox, and you'll see that there are various tests of cognition, of which, at least in this particular case, caffeine did seem to help. Also, we found that creatine supplementation can improve what's called sustained attention performance. Again, and reduce something called mind wandering in young, healthy adults. This is in collaboration with my friends in psychology and neuroscience. So these are two traditional sports supplements that in large part may work because of the effect on the central nervous system. So the field of sports neuroscience, particularly when you're combining these supplements with how it affects the brain, I think is going to be a really hot field. So for those of you who are thinking of a master's degree or a PhD, I mean, you could pretty much do anything here because it would all be new. So these are the things we learned today. One, it's really hard to get fat if you overfeed on protein. Also, high protein diets do not cause harm to your kidneys or bones. And remember the context of this. The only people who eat this much protein are people who work out hard. Your average sedentary, overweight, type 2 diabetic is not, deciding to drink whey protein while they watch TV. It's just a behavior that doesn't happen. So you got to understand the two behaviors that are coupled are you train like crazy and you eat a lot of protein. I don't think there's any other way it can happen. It's not like you can get sedentary people to eat a lot of protein. Also, having the risk alleles for the FTO SNPs, the single nucleotide polymorphisms, doesn't mean you'll lose less fat mass. In this case, calories still rule. If you cut your calories, looking at the intermittent fasting data, it looks like, well, how does it work? Well, you're eating less. Well, how do you lose fat mass if you have the risk allele for the FTO gene? Well, you eat less. I mean, it all sounds kind of simple, and in a way it actually is simple. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it is simple. And these are some potential mechanisms for protein's effects on body comp. Certainly the high thermic effect of protein, that's one. It might affect NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Also, it might suppress your appetite. So maybe in the long run, you just end up eating less because, let's face it, you're just not hungry. And so my general advice is I always look at sports nutrition or exercise science from a pragmatic point of view. Because at the end of the day, you have to give advice to people who train. And oftentimes you're giving yourself advice, right? So to me, the default macronutrient should always be protein. Figure out your protein intake, backfill the rest of your diet with carbs and fat. The reason I say that is it's really easy to eat carbs and fat. No one's ever come to me and said, wow, I'm having a hard time eating carbs. What do you suggest? I'm like, what? Where are you from? Who has a hard time with carbs and fat? It's protein that typically is difficult. So I say, don't be a minimalist. Keep your protein intake at about 1 gram per pound or 2.2 grams per kilo. Now, there are those who, they stick to this like, well, you got to be at 1.4 to 2.0 grams per kilo. Don't go above that. Well, if you don't go above that, it means you're eating something else, right? Let's say you stick to the 1.5 grams per kilo. Let's say that's what you do. Well, you still got to eat. So it means now you're eating more carbs than fat. Now, that could be a good thing or a bad thing or a neutral thing, depending on the sport you compete in. If you are a strength power athlete, do you really need all that carbs and fat? I mean, you're not expending the kind of energy that, let's say, a distance runner or swimmer would expend. So you got to decide how important the carbs and fat are for you in terms of performance. Now, in terms of physique, you're not performing anything. You're just standing in your underwear, trying to look pretty. Then, just eat a lot of protein, and minimize the carbs and fat, right? And also I put creatine down here because it's good for your muscles and your brain, right? And hey, caffeine's good for your brain too. Let's move this forward. Oops, I wanted to put this last quote here from Bruce Lee because it applies to everything, and it applies to our field. Before I learned the art, a punch was just a punch and a kick was just a kick. After I learned the art, a punch was no longer a punch and a kick no longer a kick. Now that I understand the art, a punch is just a punch and a kick is just a kick. So what the hell does this mean? Well, in our field, I think both trainers and scientists tend to, they might make things more complicated than they are. For the vast majority of sports, and I'll think of the traditional sports like football, basketball, baseball, volleyball, rugby, there's two things you got to do. You got to run, you got to lift. And the running doesn't mean distance running. It could mean, it would mean sprint interval training. And you got to lift weights. So in a sense, 90% of it is kind of easy. You got to run, you got to lift. The diet, it's kind of easy. 90% of it's easy. Don't eat a lot of junk, get plenty of protein, eat your fruits and vegetables, eat your complex carbs. Don't eat junk. That's the 90% of it, right? It's the other 10% that, of course, might matter competitively, but most people aren't really competing per se, and they're not competing for money. They're just competing against themselves. So that other 10%, it's good to have a strength and conditioning coach that knows what the hell he or she is talking about. It's good to think about which dietary supplements might help you in terms of performance. Although I think there are some dietary supplements that everyone should take, and I think one of them would be creatine. Whether you work out or not, that's one you should take. But at the end of the day, a punch is just a punch and a kick is just a kick. We all need to run. We all need to lift. And that is the end of my talk. Many people have been involved in these studies. So I just want to thank them and also thank you for listening to this soliloquy of mine. So I will entertain any and all questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Joey. First question here, Cassie. For the study on females, was there a dietary analysis completed for the other macro and micronutrients? It'd be interesting to see if this maintenance of bone mass is independent of other macros and micros.
Yeah, we actually monitored their data. We have probably somewhere between 56 to 100 24-hour recalls for their diet. So they were really good at keeping track of their diet. We didn't look at any of the micronutrients though. I would say, if I were to guess, I'd say all of them actually supplement with a vitamin and mineral. They take a vitamin and mineral supplement.